speak very early first and be able to spit out as much sentences as possible? Or should you first get lots of input and then after around 1,000 hours, 6 months, or I don't know, a year of not speaking, then after that you should speak and utter your first word? When I was a 5-year-old, I had to go to Chinese classes. And for reference, I'm right now 19 years old. And I had to go for Chinese classes for a long time, and there was a lot of speaking practices along with the stuff that we would also have to do. Let's say read this passage or memorize these lists of words, all this stuff. And after around 12 years later, after having learned nothing and being very disappointed in myself, I then discovered the immersion method. And this method really preached on the fact that you should not try to speak early on, and instead you should sort of get the language into you first of all, before then you're going to be able to, well, speak your first word. And if you try to speak for a lot early on, then what's going to happen is that you're going to fossilize your mistakes, and then you're going to have, well, mistakes that you're not going to be able to fix later on, or they're just going to be very, very annoying to then fix on later on. Simply put it, speaking early, bad. However, though, I also didn't immediately go into this because at this time I was also going to Taiwan, and naturally I would have to have spoken a lot of Chinese. Also, I was still in Chinese classes and they made us do, well, speaking exercises. Finally as well, I had also gotten a course on pronunciation after being extremely desperate in order to correct my pronunciation after my friend was pretty much, after I asked my friend to drill me so hard, I just got sick and tired of it at the point, and I just wanted like really good Chinese pronunciation very, very fast. Okay, so despite all of this, I still want to sort of do this silent period, or at least some sort of like bastardized version where at least I wasn't focused on speaking for a while. So around 2023 August, that was when I decided that I wanted to sort of just cut off all the speaking exercises that I was doing, and then pretty much just try to go all into, well, trying to just not try to speak except for, well, the necessary parts like the Chinese class that I was still going to at this point. So then what happened was that, well, I didn't do lots of speaking. Although there were some opportunities here and there, like maybe like there was like sometimes like a Chinese person, let's say on the road, I talked to them. Or maybe as well, I was also with family and also I just talked to them with sort of my Chinese that I was still inputting with. And after a while of doing this, I did get a lot of competency in terms of comprehension, and also my speaking level, I noticed, did go up. However, I never again really did any sort of focused speaking practice until this year, May 31st, was the first time I had actually recorded something for coursing. And because of this, this is pretty much the first time that I'd actually, well, done some sort of consistent speaking practice, or at least some sort of pronunciation practice after a while. And guess what? Well, I still kind of sucked at it. And I did not sound like a native at all, and pretty much I still knew that I had a lot of work in order to do, in order to then be able to sort of revive sort of this pronunciation thing that I had practiced so long ago, and also just the fact that, well, it's pretty much that even though I'd gotten so much of this input and also just those classes many, many years ago, I still didn't really have some sort of like this native level speaking level. Not only that, but even after getting my pronunciation to at least a decent level, I still got many comments from native speakers as well, where they were telling me things like, your pronunciation isn't that bad, but there's things, let's say, for example, you keep speaking with things like English grammar, or maybe use a lot of things that were unnatural. Your sentence order was sort of like this, all these little things. And I guess I'd say that I wish I'd started speaking a lot earlier into my immersion learning journey. And I'd also done it the right way, because not only just speaking a lot earlier on is going to be important, but also doing it right is at the same time. Because if you simply just try to speak as much sentences as possible early on without even getting a single bit of input and just feeling like you're forced to do it all the time, then it's also going to be a problem like this. So I'm going to teach you in this video on how to actually go and get speaking practice early on, but at the same time still focused on getting lots of input and also not trying to overwhelm yourself. So the first thing that I would tell you to do is actually something what you're not supposed to do, which is what I like to call sort of extensive speaking practice, aka you pretty much just go on as much speaking as possible early on, and then you just try to speak to yourself, or let's say speak to native speakers, and just pretty much have these conversations, but you're actually not getting any sort of feedback at all or any sort of input at all, because pretty much it will work for a little bit, where at first you're going to do things, let's say for example, let's say learn the most common phrases, let's say for greeting yourself, or talking about who you are, where you're from, or why you're learning Chinese in the first place, because many times you're actually going to have to sort of introduce yourself. You're going to have to tell people why you're learning Chinese, because you have this Waikoran accent. And this is something that I had seen very quickly, where I was speaking very early, where I was still sort of speaking early on in my immersion learning journey, and also when I was still very newbie beginner in sort of the classroom era of my speaking. However, you're pretty much going to hit a very low ceiling very early on if you just try to only speak and just try to go only conversationally, where you're only going to be limited to the conversation domain, and without enough input and getting enough exposure to other parts, then trying to be able to, let's say, form sentences in new ways is just going to become impossible. And at this point as well, you're not exactly going to be acquiring the language. Rather not, it's honestly going to be more like sort of this memorization tactic, and you're pretty much just only going to be translating it in your head. Some certain phrases, like I've just mentioned earlier, let's say the very common ones, it is going to become very automatic very quickly, because you've technically practiced them a lot of the times. But if you want to talk about more complex and more abstract things, let's say, I don't know, do you like this movie, or what's your favorite video game? It's not going to be very good for a conversation, where it's not going to be fast enough, and you're not going to be able to do it. So now that we've gotten what you shouldn't have done half the way, which is just go guns and blazing speaking, how do we actually go and speak early on? And pretty much the first thing that you should do is the same thing I had done when I was in the beginning that actually helped me, which was pronunciation practice. Yes, the first thing that you should do almost right away is pretty much get sort of the languages, or at least Chinese's sort of like pinning down how to pronounce it properly. And simply because being able to get the sounds down early on and knowing how to pretty much know what the sounds sound like, and also just sort of like trying to find the nuances between them along with listening to the language, is going to help you so much more compared to only just trying to listen to the language and having your interpretation of it and then sort of sub-vocalizing it and not exactly understanding how it works. One big example I can give right now is with tones, because you can actually pronounce tones quite easily once you actually get the hang of, let's say, how much you should do. Let's say what should be the highest point of your voice, the lowest point of your voice. Then after that, knowing, let's say, how it goes. Let's say first tone being ah, second tone being ah, and then pretty much all this stuff. But then actually trying to hear the tones is another beast of itself, because it goes very quick like that. And if you weren't able to, let's say, get this sort of tone thing early on, then what's going to happen is that it's just going to make things a lot more harder later on, compared to even if you just didn't even know what tones sounded like, or even knew how to produce them early on. Like I said again, you're not going to be able to just simply just get really fast in pronunciation practice and then be able to just understand everything. It is going to take a while in order to learn. So how do we learn it exactly? Well, first of all, with tones, as I just recommended, first what you want to do is sort of find the highest point and the lowest point of your voice. The highest point should be something that you're comfortable with, being something like, let's say with me, for example, I am a guy and my voice is usually more deeper. And then I would say something like, ah, that's pretty much my highest point of the voice. And then if I were to go to the lowest point, it would sound something like, ah, where I'd also have to sort of creak with it. And with this being said, then after that, you're going to be able to pronounce both the first tone and the third tone. Second tone and fourth tone are also easy. Second tone will usually start above sort of your lowest point of your voice and go up, while the fourth tone is usually somewhere on the top and also going down to the bottom. This is a very simplified explanation of it, and if you want to learn more on actually how to do this properly, I will go link my video on how to start Chinese from zero, and there is a section on how to do pinyin practice and also, a lot of the tone practice as well. In terms of pinyin practice as well, what you pretty much want to do is focus on, simple sounds, which is just pretty much one syllable words. Let's say, for example, ba or ta or wo. Pretty much you will focus on these simple sounds, and then you pretty much go on from there and then move on to things like pretty much pairs of sounds, which also has tones in it. Then once you're comfortable with that, you then move on to sentences. And then soon you're going to be able to then, well, improve your pronunciation slowly that way, along with getting lots of listening. And the difference with really pretty much pronunciation practice that makes it really different from just traditional speaking practice, again, is that you're more not trying to train your lips and mouth and your throat in order to then be able to pronounce certain words. Not exactly, well, mush them together and also try to form ideas about what you're trying to say and express to another person. So I'd say in order to just get your mouth moving and just get used to how to learn how to, well, produce Chinese, is that start out with pronunciation practice first of all. And this is something that you are also going to have to stick with for a while. And it is going to take a while. And even though you do even all this pronunciation practice, there are still going to be times where you are going to sound weird or unnatural, or you're going to just take your time just thinking, because, well, speaking is a whole nother beast of itself. And also, no matter how much sort of practice you'll do, the first time you'll actually speak Chinese, you're still going to sound sort of weird, and you're going to have a lot of influence from your native language or English itself come into, well, the production of sentences that you make, and even just pronunciation in general. Okay, but how do we actually start speaking Chinese though? Well, simply put it, what we're going to be doing is called topic talking, yes. And it actually gets the biggest weakness of extensive speaking practice, but actually, well, makes it good, which is simply you're going to be plateauing at a level where you can only say the basics. But instead of actually just, well, simply plateauing and only being good at speaking the basics, we're actually going to be starting with the basics, but then later on, we're going to actually be branching out to other different topics so that then you're going to be able to then speak about the things that you actually like. Also, one thing before I actually get more in depth about this practice is that you at least need to have a level of Chinese within you. At least have the basics done and also get some input, because although you don't need to wait 6 months before you speak, you still at least need to know what Chinese is or actually is, where you actually have some bits acquired within you and not actually just, well, speak Chinese and have no idea what it sounds like or actually what the sentence structure is, all these things. Okay, so now that we've known that, how do we actually do this sort of topic talking while not plateauing, like the same thing we do with extensive speaking practice? So I'm assuming if you're a complete beginner, what you want to learn first is just simply the basics. Stuff like how to greet, how to, say hello, all these things. Although these things aren't very fashionable at first, we will be expanding upon it a lot later on. And you're not going to be stuck at just this stage as long as you get adequate input. And also, well, remember that once you've already gotten good at it, to, well, move on. Okay, so what you pretty much want to do is simply just sit in front of a mirror, get a camera or any sort of thing, and then get some sort of phrase that you want to say. Let's say, for example, let's say, hi, how are you in Chinese? And then you'd pretty much get some sort of like Chinese equivalent of this phrase. And then after that, you then, well, speak it as much as you can in front of a mirror as much as possible. And then after that, once you've actually, well, automated this phrase to the point where it gets very, very easy to say it, then after that, you move on to the next one that's, well, within this topic. But then you might say, okay, this sounds all nice, but what if I make the mistakes? What if I, what if I sound unnatural? What if I actually, keep saying ni hao to people that people tell me like, oh, don't say ni hao, say this instead. All these sort of like, things that actually don't help you, and they're just, trying to make you overthink these things. Well, simply put it, what I want you to do is simply be open to corrections, but don't obsess over mistakes. Because if you try to obsess over mistakes and being perfect as much as possible, what it's going to do is just pretty much, it's just going to make you paralyzed in a way. You're not going to be able to, well, move on. You're just going to be focused on like, is this natural? Is this natural? Is this natural? This also goes to the same thing as choosing content in Chinese. Many people will say things to you, let's say, for example, oh, you shouldn't play video games in Chinese because it's unnatural. You're just going to only learn how to speak in video games in Chinese. But back to the point about, well, speaking unnaturally, which is simply, well, if you're going to try to expect to be able to speak 100% natively and naturally and not make any mistakes, you're going to be wrong, because no matter what level you are, you're still going to make mistakes and have influence from your native language come and seep into, well, the Chinese you're trying to output. In fact, I'm right now learning Taiwanese Mandarin, and there are going to be certain phrases that I will pick up and learn. If I were to use in front of a mainlander, they're not going to understand me and think what I'm speaking is unnatural and weird. For example, there is a way to say either oyster or clam in Chinese, which is called 鹅鸭 or 鹅鸭.
一下吧，第三名鹅啊煎。
And it's actually the Taiwanese pronunciation of this word. In standard Chinese, you'd actually call it 格子. If I were to use, let's say, tell a mainlander, or let's say speak to a mainlander saying 鹅鸭 or someone that doesn't speak Hokkien, then they're going to look at me confused, just wondering what I just said. So even if you, well, get things from the most native, the most natural content, aka actual native content, you're going to be making some mistakes. There are going to be people that will sometimes laugh at you, but that's up to them. And by the way, even though you do make these mistakes, I'm not telling you just to, well, solidify them and just say, oh, just because it's unnatural, I want to be able to say it all the time. No, we still want to be aiming to be a native speaker. So that's why I still recommend you have to be open to making mistakes and accepting corrections from people, because that's exactly how we learn. I'll also tell you just one time this happened to me just last week on Friday. So last week, Friday, I pretty much didn't know the way to say how to, let's say, wipe something. And I was thinking of this word called 擦. I was thinking of the word, if it even is a word, 擦巾, which is just actually just a combination of 擦, which means, well, wipe, and 干净, which is, well, clean. And then I tried saying this to a native speaker because, I wasn't, well, trying to chicken out or anything. And then she sort of like looked at me weird, just like saying like, oh, what were you trying to say, sort of like thing. So I was like saying, oh, what about, let's say, cleaning this? And then she was like, oh, 擦干净. And that's actually how you were supposed to say it naturally. And now, well, I remember it. I remember how to say it now. And if it wasn't me for just like trying to make that attempt in unnaturalness, I wouldn't actually have made more progress into actually doing it. So please do not try to worry about unnaturalness, either both input and output. Regardless of anything that you will immerse in, any sort of like phrase that you will pick up, people will always like tell you, oh, this is unnatural, or like this. And definitely as well, you will correct it in the future and you will not solidify it and like fossilize it later on, as long as you either get enough input and also are open to mistakes. Okay, so back to the point. Now that you've already practiced your phrase enough times to a point where it's, well, automatic, I'd recommend you do this for around a couple minutes a day. And then once you've gotten to the point where you've gotten, let's say, an arsenal ready of, let's say, you know how to introduce yourself and you know what to name, then we still actually have to, well, get comfortable using them in front of people. And I'd say do it at least once a week, which is going to be at least the sweet spot of also having fun and also not trying to, well, consume all your time with this. Where then after that, you actually go and try to, let's say, use the phrases you use with natives. What this is going to do is just going to make you a lot more comfortable with speaking with people, conquer your social anxiety, and also as well, simply just make connections and have a lot of fun with just speaking with native speakers. Because I'm going to be honest with you, actually connecting with native speakers is 10 times more fun than just simply sitting down and watching content or actually, well, speaking. And well, yes, well, actually, well, grinding out speaking and actually, well, getting good at practicing is one fun of itself. But actually, well, connecting with people, I found is, well, the most fun that you should do. So what you should do is pretty much, well, you should be pretty much practicing this topic, let's say once every day. However, then once a week, what you would do is then actually, well, try to use it in front of people, especially things like the basics, learning how to introduce yourself, get very, very comfortable in it. Then after that, you would be able to, well, speak this very well, and you would technically have all the basics of speaking mastered on how to introduce yourself, how then, how to actually, well, tell what, let's say, language you're learning, or let's say some basic hobbies that you have, all this stuff. But after you get to this point, how do you actually prevent yourself from plateauing? Because if we actually don't and just, well, simply move on to another topic or focus on another topic, all the exercises that I've been just telling you would be no better than just simply well, going in front of native speakers and trying to find them and then just speaking as much as you can. How do we actually go and simply, well, practice speaking outside of, well, the basics? And simple, just pick another topic and then get really good at that. Yeah, that's pretty much all. And my recommendations for, let's say, picking a topic or, let's say, domain that you want to actually go and, well, focus on is simply that you want to pick something that's a little bit more adjacent or, let's say, a certain topic that you actually like. For Example, we just finished with the basics in introducing ourselves. Maybe you want to talk more about, let's say, learning languages in Chinese, and then you probably focus on that topic and then, well, master those things first. Or maybe, let's say, you want to talk about, let's say, a certain hobby of yours that you've mentioned in, let's say, your greeting, and then you'd be able to, let's say, talk more about that. And then pretty much then after that, you'd pretty much just keep going and going and going, and then slowly and soon, you will be able to practice, well, a lot of things to the point where speaking a lot of things in Chinese just gets very, very comfortable. Now, I've already told you about this. There are still some disclaimers that I want to mention in using this. First of all, and the most obvious is that you still have to get adequate amounts of input when doing this, especially in the beginning, because if you do not actually well internalize the language into and get an actual well working sort of like model in your brain what Chinese actually is, you could do all this practice as much as you want, but it's just going to become 10 times harder because you actually don't know how to actually well speak Chinese. Because if you don't understand something, how can you actually well speak it? That's just the big problem. So make sure you get lots of input and actually well, do it. And also another disclaimer is that, well, not more of a disclaimer, but actually more of a concern is that what if I just become very, very rigid if I talk? I only, memorize phrases and, only chunk things like this. Well, number one, you will get very good at it by automation, but number two, you will find different ways to say things with the power of, well, getting lots of input and actually finding different ways to say things. So no, you're not going to be just, memorizing phrases and just doing only that at the very beginning, even though it really does feel, it exactly is like that in the beginning. But with getting more input and getting, actually more, well, practice what listening and speaking and actually internalizing the language, you will actually go and be able to pretty much be more dynamic with Chinese. Okay. Now that we've gotten through all of that, let's actually go for a recap. So first thing that you do not want to do is that pretty much just throw yourself in, let's say, in front of native speakers, or let's say just only try to speak Chinese out of the blue and just spontaneously all the time, where pretty much just all this is going to do is just, it's going to help you, let's say, getting comfortable with speaking about the basics and also help with speaking anxiety. Don't get me wrong, this is also a very fun activity, but it actually isn't something that we should do in order to then be able to, well, practice speaking and get good at it. Second thing that you want to do is that you would want to do lots of pronunciation practice, especially if your pronunciation is bad right now, or you actually have been just starting in a language right now. Don't stress about some things that you don't know about, but then after that, you still want to be able to, let's say, internalize it, because it's just going to make your life a lot easier later down the line. Third thing is then we're going to be talking about, talking, where we then want to be able to, well, speak the language properly, which is simply just goes into, well, practicing how to speak a certain thing or topic, domain, and then after getting really good at that, and then after that moving on to other domains by simply just pretty much practicing how to speak a certain way, either by, let's say right now, memorizing, let's say, phrases, or let's say very common greeting, and then later on what you would do is more spontaneous things, let's say monologuing, or then actually, well, talking about, let's say, a phrase once you've gotten to that much higher level. And then finally, well, that's all I have to say. One thing I want to talk about before we actually go and get off of this video is simply that in order to get good at, well, let's say a sport, or let's say, anything, is that you actually have to practice a lot and not actually, well, perform a lot. Because think about it. For example, I used to be a swimmer. And then what we would usually do for the majority of the swim season is, drumroll, practice a lot. Practice a lot. And the times we actually go and, well, go to, let's say, a swim meet and actually, perform and actually, show the skills that we actually, learn, is usually going to only be once every, let's say, week, 2 weeks, where we actually go and, well, let's say, perform and actually, swim and actually go through the meet. Because a lot of the part of getting good is getting through a lot of practice, and that's pretty much what topic talking, getting lots of input, and also pronunciation practice is all about. You have to get good at practice before you actually go and perform. Because if you actually were just to only perform and call that your practice, you would not have time to be able to, let's say, go back and look over things that you, let's say, didn't do well. Maybe you could, you will be able to do that, but let's be honest, you're going to be very, very, very stressed all the time and just having, let's say performances every single day to the point where you're just going to keep performing every single day. You won't have the mental capacity or time to then be able, let's say, go back, review mistakes that you made, or let's say find new ways to say things at the comfort of your own home. And even if you were to do that afterwards, that would technically be counted as speaking practice. Yes, it would be counted as practice because, well, you're going back and reviewing things that you, well, fell off of, and then you're actually, well, practicing them. It's practice. So you actually have to practice a lot in order to, well, perform well. So if you are interested, then I do have a course about communicating in Chinese where we talk about things like these. And right now it's on a pre-sale, so get it while you can. And well, that's all I have to say. So